I see this in my work, that this initial period here of rapid growth is what happens in new churches. Or we've had quite a bit of work we've been doing recently where we have had some of our more effective churches actually adopt dying churches and come in and take over the leadership and the management of that church and then re-release it. And you see this period of time of rapid growth. I mentioned two of the new starts that we're working on. If you're not familiar with this, throughout the state of Florida right now, we have 15 new starts of some form or another going on all over the annual conference right now. There are multiple forms of these, but this pattern fits. This early period of rapid growth happens because in the early life of a church, what does the church need to focus on? Okay, you're going out and starting a new church. What do you got to do? You got to find people, right? You got to find people. And so that becomes the total focus of the leadership and then the lay leadership that develops around the pastor. So as an example, the two churches I referenced earlier, the leadership of those churches, their time is consumed by figuring out creative ways to go out and connect with people where people are already located. I'll let you in on a little piece of hot news. The days of putting an ad in the paper that says church service here and people show up are over. Today, churches that will thrive are churches that go where people are already gathered and figure out a way to connect with them there. So I mentioned the Craft Brewery Christmas Eve service. They're doing yoga in the park. They're doing trivia night, where it becomes Christian trivia night in local restaurants, local bars. They are doing, in this district, you've probably heard of things like Tattoo Parlor Church and Bibles and Burritos and, going out and figuring out where people are located. But for the new church start, when the church is first beginning, there's this rapid growth because all we're worried about is finding people. Now, here's where the problem comes in. It's often been joked that a church would be a wonderful place if it wasn't all these people messing things up, But the thing that happens that we move into this second stage that is called conservation. And what begins to happen here? We build a building. We start to accumulate assets. Assets and buildings have to be protected. We have to raise money to support them. Okay. The people want Bible studies, so we need classrooms. Rather than in the early days of the church, the Bible study was maybe held in people's homes or out in a restaurant or something like that. And the growth pattern slows down because now we're trying to take care of what's already here. Okay. That's the conservation phase. Now, it's at the conservation phase that one of two things happen. Either the church continues to focus on conserving what they've already got, or they create some initiative that causes them to start on a new cycle of rapid growth. So some examples of that might be starting a new campus, starting some ministry outside of the walls of the church. Now here is the sobering news where this is the moment where I mess with you a little bit. The longer the conservation phase goes on, the more radical the new initiative needs to be. Okay? The longer you're caught in that, because its natural tendency is to drop and drop and drop. So the longer that goes on, the more radical the intervention needs to be. Now, I had the privilege, I didn't know about this stuff, but I had the privilege of watching God do a divine intervention at a church that I was at. I was appointed to a church, this was in Ohio, because this sort of thing would never happen in a church in Florida, okay? But this church, for the previous 10, 12 years, had gone through a succession of pastorates. And what would happen is that one group within the church would get into power, and they would take control of staff parish relations, and they would demand a certain type of pastor, and that pastor would come to the church. And then there'd be infighting, and the other group would get control, and they would demand a different kind of pastor. And so they went through this kind of infighting year after year, appointment season after appointment season, for 10, 12 years. And it was suffocating this church. There was no growth happening. All of the energy was being spent on who was going to be in control. I arrived at this happy location on July 1st, celebrated easily the best Christmas Eve service I've ever been a part of in my life. It was just a spectacular night, just one of those nights where everything worked the way you hoped it would, and the place was full, and it was exciting, and you could feel the presence of Christ. And that year, Christmas was on a Monday, so that would have been a Sunday night. The following Saturday, I was in my basement on the treadmill. I was getting a workout in before we were going to head out for a week of R&R. And I get a phone call from our custodian. Dan, you better come over to the church. His name happened to be Dan also. And I said, Dan, what's up? He said, well, just come on over. So I pull up in the parking lot of the church, and nothing looks out of whack. And I go inside, and there is this intense smell of smoke. It turns out that a candle had been left burning from a Thursday night worship service on the altar, which in future testing found out that the candle had bits of magnesium in it. And when it melted down so that there was just a pool of wax, it flared, which hit the poinsettias that were on wooden boxes that were on an oak altar. Can you see the flame growing and growing and growing? To the point where the sanctuary was pretty well destroyed on the inside by heat. It melted the pipes in the pipe organ. It melted 31 inches off the bottom of an aluminum cross. It boiled. We had laminate beams like you have in here. It literally boiled the glue out of the laminate beams. Okay. So the building had to come down because every engineer that walked into that building said it's got to come down. I mean, they immediately knew that it just you couldn't rebuild it. And so we started to work, and we had a long-term visioning group together. And the church said to the long-term visioning group, we want you plus the trustees to build the new structure for us because we got to get this done. We have a gym that's about maybe half to two-thirds of the size of this one that we're going to worship in. So we're breaking fire code every week in the gym. We have chairs set up down the hallway so that we can get everybody in. Which created some amazing new ministries. A hospitality ministry where some men of the church would come in with bow ties on and carry cups of coffee around the sanctuary before worship to deliver to people. So some stuff started to happen out of this. We named the temporary worship center, the gym, became known as the Phoenix because we were going to rise from the ashes. Okay? Now here's the amazing thing. All those people that had been fighting over their petty little things started working together. We completely redid the church. We built a new sanctuary. We remade the staff. We grew by 20% a year for 3 straight years. Now that was a divine intervention. Do you see what I mean? This is a church that was started in the 30s, had moved to its current location in the 50s, was headed on what was going to become a negative spiral. But what I saw was a major intervention that spurred that church on to be something new in the future. Okay? So, when you're looking at this chart, the key is, where are we on the conservation phase? And 2 things need to happen, or one of 2 things will happen, and it will happen based on your decision making. One is, we can keep trying to conserve and cling to what we've already got. Or we can release the ministry in what is called the back loop in the work by Walker and Salt. And working into the back loop gives you the opportunity to renew. Churches that are doing this are renewing. But the key is to understand where you are and then think in terms of how radical of an intervention are we willing to do for our church? How radical of an intervention are we willing to do in the name of Jesus? So one of the conversations that I want us to have in the executive decision I made is that a lot of this is going to happen over lunch rather than as part of this section here, is to wrestle with the question, where do we think First Ocala is in this process now? And then to begin to discuss, remember what I said, that part of my hope for the day was to come out of here knowing what questions to wrestle with. It's more important at this stage to be asking the right questions. So the question is, where are we in this process? And how radical are we willing to be? Now, yeah. I was introduced for many years later as a pastor who really knows how to get a church on fire. There was, when I have time, I want to write a book about that experience. We sent a letter to the congregation every Tuesday for a year and a half that explained what was going on and what we were working on. So I've got this whole chronicle of everything that happened. But yeah, that's one option here. Oh, there was a hand up over here. Yeah.
I'm not sure what the word release means.
Release is a term that Walker and Salt use. What they are talking about there is there comes a time when we have to release the church from our need to control and conserve. Okay, does that help you with that? And thank you for that, because I probably wasn't real clear about that. But another way to say it is, are we willing to go back to release this ministry to what God wants it to be? Okay, not for was. Let me make an observation. Again, this is another one of those mess with you and then I get to leave moments. But one of the things I've heard as you were commenting here, there's nothing about this to be, to feel bad about, because you share this characteristic with most churches, okay? But one of the big shifts that is happening in church life is one that is very difficult for those of us that were raised in the church in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, okay? And this, it's a difficult shift for me. Now, for the conference, I'm the person in charge of helping churches make this shift, okay? So I'm telling you, this is difficult for me too. But when I started in ministry, the challenge was, how can I get the people in the church to be friendlier to the guests that come through the door, right? You've had, I'm sure, all sorts of things around hospitality and greeting people and not having a holy huddle at the end of worship where we say, yes, we're a friendly church, when what you really mean is we're friendly to those people that we know, okay? And that was breaking up those holy huddles was the big evangelism thrust of the 80s and the 90s, let's welcome the guest that comes in. That has changed. You still want to do that, but that's not how people discover church and faith today. The unchurched, the people we want to connect with, where we're not just changing the address at which a Christian worships, but where we're actually adding people to the kingdom, those folks need to be reached where they are. And so the difference today is not come and see, but go and find. And that, from what I've heard here, is going to be a major shift in thinking, to ask yourself the question, where do we need to go and find people rather than waiting for people to come and see us, okay? Like I said, this is a mess with you moment, but it's the reality of the world that we're in today. So it is 11:54, okay? Lunch is to be served at noon. So I think what I would like to do, I want to give you a little other information and then give you your task for lunch. And we're still going to end on time. It's just that we're going to do things a little differently, okay? So this is a little bit of a shift here. If we could move the slide forward. Okay, this is one of your questions for lunch. Where in the cycle do you believe First Ocala is living today? Where are you today? Okay. And then if you could move the slide forward again and again. Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about this, and this will also be added to your lunch conversation. I just recently got off the road of touring this annual conference 3 times. We had made the decision that we were going to put a major emphasis into dinner church. You have a form of dinner church here in what you do on Tuesday mornings. It's not exactly like what we are doing, but it is similar. Dinner church is an initiative that came out of the Fresh Expressions movement. There's an organization in Seattle that has turned their complete church over to dinner church. They no longer have Sunday morning worship. They have 17 dinner churches around Seattle. And this is a program where you start at a location outside of the church in essentially a poor neighborhood, and you offer a free meal, and there is a 5 to 8 minute story that somebody tells about Jesus and what that means in their life. And then you have people that sit at the tables with those who have come for the meal and begin to work with them, and over time bring them to a place of faith. Well, I looked at the economics of this and realized that it costs the annual conference somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000 to start a new church. Okay? Hold that number. Realize that we could start 60 dinner churches, pay for the company that would come in that are the experts in this, and have them train and coach the people that were starting the dinner churches, and pay for the food for the first 6 months that these dinner churches were in operation, and start 60 of these that would average 70 to 100 people in attendance at each one. for $250,000. So in other words, we can start 60 dinner churches for less than half of the cost of starting one traditional church. Now, I'm not the sharpest crayon in the box, but those numbers seem to make sense to me, that we could reach 3,000 to 4,000 people with this dinner church initiative and get back to our roots. So, I want you to understand, I'm offering to pay to local churches 6 months of the cost of the food for the dinner church and pay half of the cost of all of the training that would ordinarily cost these churches $4,000 to $5,000 in materials that they would have to spend $1,250 on, okay, because we're doing this in such a mass basis. We identified 123 churches in the annual conference that were churches that were declining in areas where the population was growing. Okay? We have 306 churches, in the annual conference that are declining in worship attendance in areas where the population is growing. Okay? So we invited these pastors to meetings where we explained this program, that this is available to you. Okay? Here's what I heard. We'd have to redo our whole church budget, and we'd have to go back through 6 different committees to make something like this happen. Okay? I don't know where we'd find all of the people. How am I going to come up with the money after the first 6 months to pay for these monthly meals or these weekly meals? We had one pastor who prayed about this, had not talked to anybody in the church about it. After worship the next Sunday, a lady in the church came up to the pastor and said, I just came into some money. I'd like to give it to the church to use, but I don't want it to go for the electric bill. I want it to go for ministry. She said, have I got a deal for you? Okay. She explained the program. The lady said, you're funded for the first year. Do you know she could only get her ad council to approve the program by a vote of 10 to 9 after the funding was already taken care of? Here's what I learned from all of my experiences. It's up here. One is, we do not have a sense of urgency about where the church is today. There's a great book written years ago called The Frog in the Kettle. I don't know if you know the analogy of that, but if you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll react and jump out of the water. But if you put a frog in cold water and bring the temperature up to boiling, it will slowly but surely die in the boiling water. I think that's a good analogy for us right now. There's not a sense of urgency. Structure has come to dominate ministry. We think in terms of committee structure and administrative structure ahead of the urgent need to be Christ in the world. Third, we've lost our ability to trust God. What I discovered were churches that if they didn't know exactly who the people were going to be and exactly how they were going to fund the first 2 years of this ministry, they weren't willing to start. Which says to me, we've lost our ability to trust that God will provide if we're doing God's work. And the fourth I discovered, this one isn't a surprise, but that leadership is critical. You gathered here, I'm assuming, are the leaders in this church. Leadership is critical to moving the church forward. People who have the courage to go out and do the work of God. So here's the discussion questions for lunch. The first one I mentioned to you was already up there, which is, where do you think First Ocala is on its cycle? And the second question that closely follows that is, which of these 4 do you think is your greatest challenge? Pick one. But what one of those do you think is your greatest challenge? Okay? Which one of these 4? Urgency, structure dominating ministry, the ability to trust God, or leadership? Which of those are your